All right, welcome back to The Explainer. So today we're diving into some archaeological research that is pretty much going to completely rethink human history for us. What if I told you that our ancestors were throwing back a prehistoric pint thousands of years before they ever laid the first bricks of a city? I know, it sounds wild, right? But it's exactly what the scientific and archaeological evidence is pointing to. We are looking at a massive paradigm shift in how we understand the very dawn of human culture.
Okay, let's dive right into this because this number is, well, it's absolutely staggering. 10,000. 10,000 years ago. That's the era we're looking at when we talk about the very first humans consuming alcohol. I mean, we're talking about a time way before kingdoms, before the invention of the wheel, and long before the first written word was ever etched into stone.
Which naturally brings us to this massive question. Alcohol before cities? Really? How is it even possible that prehistoric hunter-gatherers, people who are still just trying to survive the daily physical challenges of a totally wild, untamed world, how are they brewing beverages before civilization as we know it even existed? It totally feels like putting the cart before the horse, doesn't it?
Well, to find the answer, archaeologists had to literally brush the dirt off these broken clay jars that are nearly 9,000 years old. That takes us all the way back to around 7,000 BC. And get this, deep inside the microscopic cracks of these ancient pots, scientists found something that fundamentally changed history: chemical traces of alcohol. These early humans were already actively experimenting with some pretty complex liquid mixtures.
So the crucial point here is who actually figured this out? Take a second and just guess. Who discovered alcohol first? Like which brilliant ancient innovator sat down by a prehistoric campfire, looked at a handful of berries and some water, and just conjured up the very first primitive brew?
Well, the answer is nobody. Nature invented it first. Actually, scratch that. Humans didn't invent alcohol at all. We really just stumbled upon it. Mother Nature was already out there in the wild, quietly brewing this stuff on the forest floor long before humans ever even arrived on the scene.
The progression of this whole microscopic process is actually super simple but really elegant. Basically, step 1, fresh fruit gets a bit too overripe and falls to the ground. Step 2, natural wild yeast microbes, which, by the way, are just floating around invisibly everywhere in the environment all the time, they find that fruit and start eating the sugar crystals inside it. And step 3, as the yeast consumes that sugar, it creates these tiny sparkling bubbles, and bam, alcohol is naturally produced.
To be super precise about it, what's actually bubbling up out of that wild fruit on the forest floor is ethanol. That's the specific chemical compound produced during that natural fermentation process. It's literally science happening entirely by accident, powered by nothing more than rain, some crushed fruit, naturally occurring wild yeast, and, just a little bit of time.
And here's where it gets kinda hilarious, honestly. Because humans aren't the only ones partaking. Even today, scientists regularly observe wild animals, we're talking elephants, monkeys, birds, just accidentally eating this naturally fermented fruit. They gorge on the fallen berries, and moments later they're wobbling playfully and just staggering around harmlessly through the jungle. It's wild to think about.
So, enter human curiosity. Just picture a prehistoric human standing at the edge of a forest, watching a monkey acting, well, very strangely after eating some bubbling fruit off the ground. Driven by humanity's absolute greatest strength, our relentless curiosity, that human picks up a similar piece of fermented fruit, gives it a sniff, and takes a very cautious bite. And that small, totally random moment of discovery, it might have changed human history forever.
Which brings us to our next section, humanity's first recipes. This is where we move from accidental discovery straight into intentional brewing.
You see, once our ancestors tasted that natural fermentation and felt its effects, everything shifted. They realized, hey, we don't have to wait for a hollow tree trunk to fill with rain and rotting fruit. We can actually recreate nature's bubbling process on purpose. The oldest known evidence we have of this kind of intentional brewing comes from an ancient Neolithic village in China, nearly 9,000 years ago. By blending ingredients like wild rice, raw honey, fresh fruit, and water into these beautifully crafted ceramic jars, they created a really cloudy, fermented drink. So they weren't exactly making the crisp, clear modern beer you might be picturing in a pint glass, but rather this complex, primitive brew that's really unlike anything we drink today.
And this brilliantly illustrates why this whole discovery was just so vital. Over in ancient Mesopotamia, the birthplace of civilization, beer literally became a matter of survival. Instead of risking unsafe river water that was completely filled with dangerous invisible microbes, they drank ancient beer.
Because the brewing process requires boiling and fermentation, it actually killed off all those harmful germs. So in those days, reaching for a clay cup of beer was often a much safer hydration choice than taking your chances drinking straight from the river.
And because it was safe, alcohol became deeply woven into the absolute fabric of daily life in places like ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. I mean, it wasn't just for celebrations anymore. It was given to builders and workers as wages, literally replacing coins. It was offered to the gods by priests in heavily decorated temples, enjoyed by families laughing around the dinner table, and healers even mixed it with herbs to use as, believe it or not, medicinal remedies. The whole shebang.
But of course, every silver lining has a cloud, right? That brings us to the double-edged sword, looking at the biological consequences of ancient brewing.
We really have to ask a critical question here as we look at the historical balance. Was this ancient discovery ultimately helping humanity build civilization, or was it hurting it? Well, the answer is kind of a little bit of both. On one hand, we see these incredible societal benefits, right? Safe hydration, social bonding at community feasts, deeply rooted religious rituals. But on the flip side, ancient people also quickly discovered that drinking too much led to impaired judgment, a loss of physical balance, and just generally poor decision-making. Literally thousands of years ago, long before modern medicine was even a thought, ancient elders were already sitting around campfires warning the younger villagers about these very real physical consequences.
And today, modern science explains exactly what those ancient elders were witnessing back then. It's all about slowing the signals. When ethanol enters the brain, it physically slows down the communication between your nerve cells. Those glowing electrical signals in your brain, they just take a lot longer to get where they need to go. And that perfectly explains why it changes the way people think, feel, and physically move.
Ultimately, though, the story of alcohol isn't really just about a fermented drink at all. History begins with curiosity. Think about it. That very same human drive, the exact curiosity that made a prehistoric person take a cautious bite of a bubbling, fermented piece of fruit off the ground, is the exact same curiosity that led to the discovery of fire, the planting of the first seeds for farming, and really, the birth of civilization itself. So I'm going to leave you with this thought today. How many other monumental pillars of our modern world started as nothing more than a curious accident, just waiting out there in the wild for someone bold enough to try it? Something to think about for sure. Thank you so much for exploring with us today.